"What are you going to do?" she asked. And his answer was, "I don't know. I just don't know." Sometimes we experience things in life that either seem to be or actually are impossible. Situations where there is really nothing we can do, where we have no answer. So what do we do in those situations? Today we're going to draw some principles from the life of Hezekiah on how to face the impossible. But first we learn a little about his godly character, which that in itself, godly character in itself, is key to facing the impossible. But Hezekiah was a godly leader. So we begin in chapter 18 and verse 1. In the third year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. And so last week we read about Hoshea, who was the last king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Well, now we meet Hezekiah. Hezekiah became king in the third year of Hoshea, so about 6 years before Israel was taken away into exile. But we read about Hezekiah. What we read about Hezekiah is refreshing. Do you remember who his father was? His father was Ahaz. And Ahaz is the guy who, when he was defeated by Syria and then the Assyrians, he adopted their gods because he figured, oh, maybe they're stronger or whatever. And he closed the temple in Jerusalem. And he took all of the dedicated things, the things that were dedicated to God, and he used them to set up altars all over to false gods, to worship false gods. But now Hezekiah is king, and he is a good king. We've gotten used to hearing the words, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. But not Hezekiah. He did what was right in the sight of God. He was faithful to God. In fact, he's compared to David here, who's the greatest example of Israelite kings. And as we've said before, this doesn't mean that he's perfect, because we know that David wasn't. But this is a summary of his life and his character. His normal way of life was obedience and faithfulness to God. He did what was right. Verse 4. He removed the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah. And he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. And so the summary of his life continues with some details. And this first one is so important because unlike his father, who built the high places and told people, encouraged idolatry, Hezekiah tore down those high places. He destroyed the idols. But then we're told about this one idol in particular. And it's surprising. Back when Israel was wandering in the wilderness, after the Exodus and before they came into the land, there was a time when the people were being bitten by poisonous snakes. And God told Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a stick in the middle of the camp. And whenever someone was bit, they could look towards that serpent as a way of expressing their faith in God, and God would heal them. Well, at some point after that, the people started, their thinking got twisted, and some started worshiping that metal snake. They made an idol of it. And apparently this has been going on for many years. But Hezekiah puts an end to it, and he destroys the bronze serpent. Verse 5. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments of the Lord that the Lord commanded Moses. So Hezekiah's reign he reigned in a very tumultuous time. I mean, Assyria is conquering everyone. They're making vassal nations of everybody, and they've even carried off the northern kingdom of Israel into exile. And so there's danger everywhere, but Hezekiah trusts God. It says that he held fast to God. So he didn't turn from him, but he obeyed him and he was faithful. And because of this, he stood out amongst the kings. He was different than the other kings, and this is why he was a great king. Verse 7. And the Lord was with him wherever he went, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. He struck down the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from watchtower to fortified city. In the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. And at the end of 3 years, he took it. In the 6th year of Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel, Samaria was taken. The king of Assyria carried the Israelites away to Assyria and put them in Halah and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, but transgressed his covenant, even all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. They neither listened nor obeyed. And so we're told here that God was with Hezekiah and he made him prosper. Now, if you remember, Ahaz, his father, was made to submit to the Assyrians. He was made a vassal. So he submitted to them, he was under authority, he had to pay tribute. So when Hezekiah became king, Judah was under Assyria's control, and they had to pay tribute. But at some point, Hezekiah refused to pay, and he refused to submit to Assyria. And so then he also went and he attacked the Philistines and won. Now, this is significant here, not just because the Philistines were an old enemy, but because the Philistines at this time were vassals of the Assyrians. And so this was an attack against Assyria to do this. And it weakened Assyria's hold on the region. Well, then we're reminded here about the fall of Samaria, of the northern kingdom. And it may seem a little odd because we just had this long, detailed description of their sin and of their fall, their exile, in the last chapter. But here, it's brought up again in order to highlight the contrast with what happened to the northern kingdom and what God has done for faithful Hezekiah. Hezekiah was able to rebel against Assyria, and he succeeded. But Hoshea, if you remember, he rebelled and was taken out. The difference between the two is that Hezekiah obeyed God, and God helped him. And so now that we've read this summary of Hezekiah's reign, we move on to a specific major event. Hezekiah will find himself in an impossible situation. And we're going to see what he does and draw 5 principles for how to face the impossible. So we keep going then in verse 13. He says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. And the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorpost that Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. And so things were going well till around the 14th year of his reign. And there's a new king in Assyria. His name is Sennacherib, and he comes to fight against Judah. Now, on one hand, this is totally expected. I mean, Hezekiah has rebelled against Syria, and so the king wants to reestablish his control over Judah. On the other hand, it may be unexpected because we just read that Hezekiah trusted God, and God protected him and gave him success. But we need to remember this. Trusting God doesn't mean that there will be a complete absence of trouble in your life. But it means that you can rely on him and you can lean on him during that trouble, and he will bring you through it. But at this point, we see Hezekiah's faith waver a little. The Assyrians have retaken the Philistine land, and they've conquered some fortified cities in Judah, and they're headed towards Jerusalem. And what does Hezekiah do? Well, he sees what's coming, and he sends message to Sennacherib and submits to him. He's scared, and he says that he was wrong to rebel against him and against Assyria, and he will give them whatever they want. Whatever the king wants, as long as he leaves him alone. In other words, if he doesn't kill him, doesn't imprison him, he'll give him whatever he wants. So Sennacherib agrees to this, and he requires a very large amount of silver and gold. It amounts to about a literal ton of gold, and about 25 tons of silver. Now, it appears at this point that Hezekiah forgets to trust God, or to even consult God, and instead he just pays off his attacker. And where's he come up with all that silver and gold? Well, some of it came from his palace, okay, but he also empties out God's temple in order to pay. He even scrapes the gold off the doors that he had just recently repaired and covered with gold. Scrapes the gold off the door so he has enough. This was not a good idea. For one thing, he failed to trust God, and then he also gave away what belonged to God. He put his trust in his ability to pay off the attacker rather than trusting in God. And we'll see in a minute that this didn't result, it didn't have the result he hoped for. It didn't work. So principle number one for facing the impossible: be sure that the practical steps you take honor God. You might see a way to take care of the problem that you're facing, but be careful you don't dishonor God or disobey God in the process. Be sure the practical steps you take honor God. Verse 17. And the king of Assyria sent the Tartan and the Rabsaris and the Rabshakeh with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And they went up and came to Jerusalem. When they arrived, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the highway to the washer's field. And when they called for the king, there came out to them Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna, the secretary, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder. And the Rabshakeh said to them, "Say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, on what do you rest this trust of yours? Do you think that mere words are strategy and power for war? In whom do you now trust, that you have rebelled against me? Behold, you are trusting now in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust in him. But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord, or Yahweh our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem?" So we see Sennacherib wasn't a man of his word. So right after he got all that silver and gold, he decides to send his huge army to Jerusalem anyway. 3 of his officials go with him as well, and they call for Hezekiah to come out to them. Now, obviously, the king isn't going to give himself up that easily, and so some of his officials from Judah go out to meet with him. And when the Assyrian representative speaks, it's clear that they have good intelligence on Judah and on Hezekiah, what's been going on, because they know what's happened. They know about Hezekiah's tendency to trust Yahweh, to trust God. And they challenge Hezekiah and they tell him that there is no one he can trust to deliver him from the great king of Assyria. They're saying it was very unwise to rebel against him. So they say that he says that Hezekiah can't talk his way out of this problem. He says Hezekiah can't depend on Egypt. Because Egypt is weak and trusting them will just go bad for you, will get you in trouble. He's saying it's dumb to trust them. Of course, the prophet Isaiah in chapters 30, Isaiah 30 and 31 says the same thing. He already said it. Don't trust them. But then they attack the idea of trusting in God, trusting Yahweh. Notice, though, that he says that they can't count on God's help. Why? Because Hezekiah has taken all the altars away, all the high places. He clearly doesn't understand Yahweh. They think that Hezekiah is weaker because he told them to sacrifice only at the temple. They think he's weaker because he took away those high places and tore down those altars. But did this stop the people from honoring God? No. In fact, he is leading them in proper worship, in the proper way to honor God. And so the official, he thinks that this was a bad move by Hezekiah, but it was actually the best thing Hezekiah could have done. On the other hand, this official also knows that not everyone, not all the people in Judah agree with him, with Hezekiah. Not everyone is happy about what Hezekiah has done. And so he may be saying this to try to divide the nation. And so people won't follow Hezekiah. Keep reading verse 23. Come now, make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses, if you are able to, on your part, to set riders on them. How can you repulse a single captain among the least of my master's servants when you trust in Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? Moreover, is it without the Lord that I have come up against you, this place to destroy it? The Lord Yahweh said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. Okay, so now he's mocking them. And he says, you can't win a battle against Assyria even if we gave you 2,000 horses. He's saying they don't have enough skilled warriors. They're weak. But then came the biggest taunt. He says that Yahweh himself sent them to destroy Jerusalem. Now, could that be true? They might wonder. It's most likely a lie, but the prophets have warned that if they're not faithful to God, that this could happen. And it did just happen to the northern kingdom. And so this is a very effective tactic, because it's going to make them all wonder, did God send them? And this could totally demoralize them. Verse 26. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah said to the Rabshakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall. But the Rabshakeh said to them, has my master sent me to speak these words to your master and you, and not to the men sitting on the wall, who are doomed with you to eat their own dung and drink their own urine? Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out in a loud voice in the language of Judah, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord by saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hand of the king of Syria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me. Then each one of you will eat of his own vine, and each one of you his own fig tree, and each one of you will drink the water of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey, that you may live and not die. And do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you by saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of the Sepharvaim, Hena and Iva? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their lands out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Israel or Jerusalem out of my hand? But the people were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's command was, do not answer him. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and Joah the son of Asaph the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him the words of the Rabshakeh. So the officials from Judah, they don't want the common people to hear what's being said, because it could discourage them. And so they asked the Assyrians to speak in Aramaic, which was kind of like the common trade language of the time. And so all the officials knew how to speak it, but the common people didn't. But the Assyrians want all of the people to hear and understand. So he speaks even louder. And he wants them to be discouraged. He wants them to distrust Hezekiah's leadership, and he wants them to surrender. And so what's his tactic here? First, he wants Judah to feel powerless and defeated. So he tells them something that no one would ever want to hear. He lets them know that they are doomed to eat their own dung and drink their own urine. Now that's just gross. And this might be hyperbole, but not necessarily. You see, when a city was sieged, the enemy army would attempt to break through the walls, but they would also just camp outside the city. And the people who lived in the city or from the surrounding areas would lock themselves inside the walls of that city. And then they would wait each other out. The people inside the city would hope that the army would eventually just leave for some reason, like they got tired of waiting, or they ran out of food, or they had to go fight somewhere else, or whatever, you know. And the army would just wait till the people inside the city ran out of food and water. At this point, when people have no food and water and they are starving, they will eat things they would not normally eat. But his point in all of this is that they should just give up now before it comes to that. Secondly, he wants them to know that they have another choice. You have a better choice than suffering or dying. And that's surrender. You see, if they surrender to him, well, they would be, they could then eat their food and have it okay. They'd be left alone. Eventually he'd come and he'd relocate them, but then they would still have their own land and their own food and everything else they needed. And so if they surrender, life will be good. And then thirdly, he wants them to decide that Hezekiah can't be trusted. I mean, he's suggesting that Hezekiah is misleading them, that Hezekiah is telling them they can stand up to the Assyrians and live, that Hezekiah is telling them that God will deliver them, but he's saying that Hezekiah is wrong. And then the officials argue that that it's illogical for you to think that that God can save them, because no other God has been able to save his people, his land, their land. Because the Assyrians are just too powerful. And so he's basically saying that Hezekiah will fail you, God will fail you, you're in a hopeless situation, but you could have it good. Just reject Hezekiah's leadership and don't put your trust in Yahweh. But what do the people do? The people obey Hezekiah and just keep quiet. And the Judean officials, they give no answer. They just walk away, return to Hezekiah with their clothes torn. They are distraught. So principle number 2 for facing the impossible. Reject worldly voices that deny God. People may say, well, you're missing out by following God. There's no reason to trust in him or do things his way. They may say that God's not helping you, so just forget about him and join us. Recognize that what they say for the nonsense that it is, and keep trusting God. Reject worldly voices that deny God. Chapter 19, verse 1. As soon as King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. And he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna, the secretary, and the senior priests, covered with sackcloth to the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos. They said to him, thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. It's an illustration to say things are terrible. It may be that the Lord your God heard all the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words that the Lord your God has heard. Therefore, lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. And so when Hezekiah hears what the Assyrian delegation has said, he tears his own clothes in distress. And he expected that after paying the king this large amount of silver and gold, everything would be fine. But now he finds out that he's still in danger. And at this point, I think he realizes his error of putting his trust in silver and gold. And he repents and he does the right thing. He sends some leaders to the prophet Isaiah to hear what God has to say about the situation. And he's trusting in God. He wants to hear from God. This is the perfect response. But he's upset and he's scared and he turns to God. He's distraught because he knows there's nothing he can do to fix this situation. He knows that he's too weak. He doesn't have the strength to resist this enemy. Also, at this point, they've mocked God. They've said that God can't save them. And Hezekiah knows that's not true. But he doesn't know how God will respond to this. Hezekiah made many changes for good in Judah. But there are still many people living in Judah who were disobedient. And God may let them be defeated. He is in a terrible situation. He's scared. He's weak. But he knows who he can trust. And so Hezekiah tells Isaiah to pray to God on behalf of the remnant. In fact, in other words, those who are faithful to God and who are still following God. And Isaiah immediately gives Hezekiah a straightforward answer. Don't let what they said scare you. They mocked God, and God will win this battle. The king of Assyria will hear of trouble and will go home. And at some point, he will be killed there at home. Principle number 3 for facing the impossible. Turn to God and listen to him. Sometimes we just need to stop and hear what God has to say. Are you scared? Well, cast your cares on him. Spend time with him. Take time to listen to him. He is your greatest source of help and strength. And peace comes from him. So turn to God and listen to him. Verse 8. The Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria fighting against Libnah, for he heard that the king had left Lachish. Now the king heard concerning Tirhakah, king of Cush, behold, he has set out to fight against you. So he sent messengers again to Hezekiah, saying, thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, devoting them to destruction. And shall you be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered them? The nations that my fathers destroyed, Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who were in Telassar? Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of Shepharvaim, the king of Hena, or the king of Iva? And so the Assyrian officials, they leave to go to the king, and now at this point the king is busy fighting another battle on another front near Egypt. And so he can't come attack Jerusalem right now, but he sends another message to Hezekiah. It's really more of the same rhetoric, but there's one thing that's different. Before, they said that Hezekiah was deceiving them, the people, into trusting God. Now, he says that God himself is deceiving them and saying that you could trust him, but you can't. Is what he's saying. So he's saying, so don't be foolish and trust his promises. And so they had just asked God through the prophet about this situation. And God had told them not to worry. But now they get this letter saying, don't trust your God. And the threat hasn't changed. They're still making the same threats. They haven't gone home. And they say they are still coming to Jerusalem. And no one can save the people of Jerusalem. It looks like nothing has changed. So can Hezekiah trust God? Should he trust God? Yes. And that's exactly what he does. Verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are God. You are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made the heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste to the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire. For they were not gods, but the works of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they were destroyed. So now, O Lord our God, save us, please, from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Lord, are God alone. So when he gets this message from the Assyrian king, Hezekiah goes to God again. He goes to the temple and he lays the letter before God. And he prays. And he gives the whole situation to God. And he confesses the truth about God. That he is the one true God. And he alone is God. These others were destroyed because they weren't God. And he confirms his faith in God and says that here's the problem. The Assyrians have conquered so many nations and they destroyed their idols. And now Sennacherib is mocking the one true God and arrogantly saying he's coming to destroy him as well. But Hezekiah says that he's trusting in God. And he asks God directly to save them and to let everyone know that Yahweh is the only true God. Let's look at the response, verse 20. Then Isaiah the son of Amoz sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, your prayer to me about Sennacherib, king of Assyria, I have heard. This is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him. She despises you. She scorns you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She wags her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem. He's speaking to the king of Assyria. Whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes to the heights? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your messengers you have mocked the Lord, and you have said, with my many chariots I have gone up to the heights of the mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon. I felled its tallest cedars, its choicest cypresses. I entered its farthest lodging place, its most fruitful forest. I dug wells and drank foreign waters, and I dried up with the sole of my foot all the streams of Egypt. Have you not heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from days of old what now I bring to pass, that you should turn fortified cities into heaps of ruin, while their inhabitants, shorn of strength, are dismayed and confounded, and have become like plants of the field and like tender grass, like grass on the housetops, blighted before it's grown. But I know you're sitting down, and you're going out and coming in, and you're raging against me. Because you have raged against me, and your complacency has come into my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will turn you back on the way by which you came. So in response to Hezekiah's prayer, God gives Isaiah a message for him. It's stated as if he's speaking to the king of Assyria, but it's for Hezekiah and God's people to hear. It tells them that God will definitely protect Jerusalem. God says that Sennacherib has mocked him, and that God will turn things around on him. He's said that he'd destroy God, but God will destroy him. Also, the king arrogantly boasted of his great power and all his successes in battle, and how he's taken people's land from them. And he claims to be unstoppable, but he's not. God tells him that he's only been successful because it was part of God's plan. God made it happen. He's directed the path of history here. And the king has no place to be proud, and God will bring him down. God knows all that Sennacherib has done and how he has arrogantly mocked and challenged him. And God will bring the king's success to an end. God will send him home. He says, I'm going to put a hook in his nose or a bit in his mouth. I'm going to take him home. Principle number 4 for facing the impossible. Pray. Lay everything out before the Lord. Talk to God. Tell him everything that's happening. Tell him how you're feeling. Tell him that you're trusting in him. Praise him for who he is. And what if it looks like nothing is happening? Keep praying. The most important thing you can do is talk to God. And it may be the only thing you can do. So pray. Lay everything out before the Lord. We continue on verse 29. And this shall be a sign for you. This year eat what grows of itself, and in the second year what springs of the same. Then in the third year sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And the surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem shall go a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord will do this. So this is more of the message from God through Isaiah. He's telling Judah what will happen here in the future. He says that this year and the next, that the people of Judah will just eat whatever grows on its own. In other words, this assault on Judah by Assyria has made a mess of the land, and they're not able to plant their crops. And so let's just harvest whatever grows up on its own. But in the third year, things will be back to normal. And God says this is a sign for them. You see, right now they're surrounded by the army. They're being threatened by the army. They're being insulted. Things look really bad. It doesn't look like things are ever going to get back to normal. But God has said that he will deliver them. So in the third year, when they harvest their crops, they can look back and know that God did what he promised. But they can also look forward to the future and know that whatever happens, there will always be a remnant in Judah. There will always be some who are faithful to God. And God's people will survive because God will make it happen. Verse 32. Therefore, thus says the Lord God concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city or shoot an arrow there or come before it with a shield or cast up a siege mount against it. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return, and he shall not come into this city, declares the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David. And so this is another direct promise that God will save them. But not only will they not be destroyed, they won't even be hurt by the Assyrians. The army won't do anything to them, not even shoot a single arrow into the city. The city won't be attacked by them because the Assyrian king will go home. He won't step foot in Jerusalem, because God will defend the city. And God gives two reasons here why he's going to save Jerusalem from the Assyrians. The first is for his own sake. God has been blasphemed by the king of Assyria, and God will protect his reputation. And secondly, for David's sake. God made a promise to David, and God will keep it. Hezekiah and the descendants of David will not be destroyed. The line of David will not be lost, and Messiah will sit on his throne. Verse 35. And that night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and lived at Nineveh. And as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, Adramelech and Sharezer, his sons, struck him down with the sword and escaped into the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his place. And so this is how it all ended. As the Assyrian army is in their camp, one night God defeats them. And one night 185,000 of them just die. When the rest of them wake up in the morning and they see what's happened, Sennacherib knows he's been defeated and he goes home. God protected Jerusalem, just like he said he would. And then we know from Assyrian history that about 20 years passes. But after 20 years, Sennacherib is killed by the sword, by his sons. Killed by the sword in his own land, just as God said he would be. So principle number 5 for facing the impossible: wait on the Lord. Sometimes we can get impatient and wonder why God isn't moving. And we may want to tell God how to do it, or what to do, or when to do it. Wait on him. Rest in him. And he knows what's best, and he has a far better perspective than we do. So wait on him. And just because something God has said will happen doesn't happen right away, it doesn't mean it won't happen. So just keep trusting him. Wait on the Lord. And so we've seen these 5 principles for facing the impossible. But let me wrap this up with just a couple thoughts. First, God is always strong and trustworthy. No matter how weak God's people are, God is not weak. No matter how weak we are, God is not weak. And so when we are weak, when we turn to him, he gives strength. He makes us strong. And so when you're weak, lean on him. And secondly, trusting God doesn't necessarily mean that you will not have any troubles. We saw that here with Hezekiah. He trusted God, and he was godly, and he was doing what was right, and the army came against him and threatened to destroy him. God doesn't always take all our troubles away, but he helps us through them. In fact, the New Testament tells us that as a follower of Jesus, we can expect trouble. But trusting God means that we can rely on him in the midst of trouble. And he will help us get through it. So when you face trouble, even things that seem impossible, take it to God. We may not know how God will deal with the problem, but we know that he will be with us. And when we wait on him, he gives strength. And he gives peace that passes understanding, even in the face of the impossible.